Welcome to the Diverse Minds podcast, where we give you the tips, tools, and techniques you need to be a mentally healthy and inclusive leader. Each week, you'll hear about a variety of topics linked to mental health, well-being, and diversity that will enhance both your professional practice and personal well-being.
Welcome to the 272nd episode of the award-winning Diverse Minds podcast. On today's episode, I'm going to be talking about the difference between a policy model versus a liberation model for equity, diversity, and inclusion. Don't forget, the podcast is now fortnightly, but if you're missing weekly content, you have 5 years worth of work to reflect back on. And if you want my handy guide that lists the episodes with a clickable link, you can get it at bit.ly/DMPG23. So this week, I've been facilitating race reciprocal mentoring training workshops for a higher education body. And if you want to know more about race reciprocal mentoring, then check out episode 128, Reciprocity in a Mentoring Relationship. Some of the discussions I had with the white mentors was around how do we change the system if we are focusing just on one person and one conversation? And this got me thinking about policy models versus liberation models. So policy models center on creating a well-written, robust policy within a system, a current system that's operating to address a topic, in this case, equity, diversity, and inclusion, through established procedures and frameworks with a more structured and I would say less radical approach to change, the way society sees radical at the moment. On the other hand, a liberation model focuses on actively challenging and dismantling oppressive systems to achieve social change by empowering groups of people who face discrimination and centering their lived experiences. Now, I think if any organization or group of people or community group is serious about real, tangible change in equity, we have to focus on liberation first and policy as a way to capture things in the written format. We can write the best policies in the world, but often they sit on dusty e-shelves. This is also why equity, diversity, and inclusion conversations go round and round in circles and no real change is made. There's been very little progress data-wise, the stories are the same, sadly, and I hear the same things over and over again. And there's a really interesting article in the British Psychological Society's webpage by Dr. Maggie Evans, and she talks about talent liberation, and the link is in the show notes. But I'm going to read one paragraph from that article that really sat with me, actually. And it's a subtitle. The subtitle is called Cult of Individual Heroes. The second premise draws on research to indicate that a group of high-performing individuals does not necessarily guarantee organizational success and suggests that high performance is a result of teams as well as individuals. Much of the cult of individual heroes is predicated on the idea that talent is a fixed trait and people who possess this can work miracles, a bit like the star striker or in football, brought in to rescue a failing football team. They can be set a near impossible task and it does not end well. Now, this is a really interesting perspective. And as I say, not many organizations are doing or getting it right. And indeed, if you want to know more about white dominant norms, do check out my series of 4 podcasts about that, because I think this really reflects that Eurocentric culture around individuals and hailing individuals. But we're not glorified as individuals. We can't actually do things on our own because humans are pack animals. And if we think about many global majority cultures, there is so much strength in numbers and in communities and in recognition that we can't do it on our own. And indeed, with many phrases in a variety of languages that emphasize this in terms of stories and proverbs. So I really hope you're enjoying the content of the podcast so far and you want to keep up to date. Then why not join my newsletter? When you join my mailing list, you'll receive a free copy of my ebook, The Mentally Healthy Leading Manager. And that link is bit.ly/MHLMEBKLNK. Well, how can organizations move from a policy to a liberation model? I think one of the things that you have to start with is thinking about systemic advantages and disadvantages and where the power, that's not individual power, because I know people have agency individually and power individually, but where in an organization are the senior leaders, maybe what kind of background they've had, and the kinds of barriers they face or don't face indeed in their day-to-day life. So you have to think about the current picture. And the liberation model is really about confronting these power imbalances and systemic oppressions and looking at the barriers. So the aim is to transform the structures causing those inequalities. So a policy model might look at the existing structures to mitigate issues and not address the root causes. And I think this is the biggest barrier. And it's a bit like the social model of disability as well, because that's very much around, well, no one's actually disabled. It's society that disables people. If someone's a wheelchair user, that's not a disability. What's disabling for a wheelchair user is not having a way to navigate around a building, access certain spaces, etc. The other thing is the liberation model emphasizes that individuals do have power and agency within themselves and can participate in their own empowerment and liberation. And a policy model is much more around how do we implement changes? What's the process? Where does it go? What's the chain of command? So it does feel quite top down, top heavy. Ultimately, someone has to make a decision. Now, I'm not saying you get rid of all that in an organization. I appreciate there has to be some kind of control pathways, but how can people participate in that and change certain systems and ways of doing things? It won't all be impossible or all be impossible to move. And the other thing is that policy models are very centered on, and I'm laughing because I'm thinking about higher education in particular, this obsession with data, more data, more data, more data. We have lots of data. And in fact, the government's proposed social care review, there are tons of literature reviews. There are tons of reviews that have been done from a number of statutory and third sector organizations. We don't need another 3-year review. We need to look at what's already been done and get moving. So that's a very helpful, I think, example of a policy model, obsessing over data-driven approaches. And then someone who's seen as an expert in this, in the case of the social care review, Louise Casey. And if you have listened to a previous episode, you know I've mentioned Louise Casey's review on certain her I think very unhelpful phraseology around communities that she has no connection with and their parenting. So my heart's in my mouth, I have to be honest. Whereas liberation models will look at a critical analysis of societal structures. And I think this is so important, and especially if we are thinking about using the example of care, social care in the UK at the moment, and the power dynamics to understand these root causes of what's going wrong and oppression. And of course, there's a huge link with poor care and poverty, poor care and deprived communities, poor care and under-resourced areas. You know, the stories of people dying in their homes because they had no heating and no food and not having any, there's still been no real recourse. And actually the individual I'm thinking of is from the Black community. So it's all tied up. And I think you can do all the reviews in the world you want, but it's not acknowledging that human story for me. So the other thing is it was around liberation in education. So this is about teaching, education and teaching methods that will aim to give students more control over their learning, and also to look at whose story is told and remembered, how they're remembered, and whose stories are glorified. So created in Brazil by Brazilian educator Paulo Freire, and it's about an anti-oppressive approach that gives students more say in what and how they learn. And I think many of us as facilitators, we could absolutely take this into the facilitation space as well. It's also about enabling students to show their learning in creative ways. So this very much links to universal design and learning as well. They're massive crossovers. And how to incorporate topics like equality, equity, diversity, inclusion, and liberation into the curriculum. So again, linking to decolonizing the curriculum, for example, we can use this in adult learning, whether it's traditional adult learning in terms of education in a university or exec ed, but also facilitation and what could be considered more workplace training. And it's also about doing things differently when it comes to recruitment, language that's used, and moving away from blame and individual focus to collectivity and thinking, what can we as a collective, as a workplace do differently? So in summary, a policy model might be a government agency looking at a policy to increase access to healthcare. And this is where this word hard to reach groups really comes in. I think it really smacks of the policy model for low resourced individuals in deprived areas, economically deprived areas, by creating new eligibility guidelines and funding mechanisms. Okay, so that will be helpful to some people. I'm not saying we should get rid of it all, but does it really, get to the heart of things? Whereas a liberation approach is going to be much more about working with communities, working with people in deprived communities, finding out what they want, advocating for them, completely redressing that, looking at the funding systems that they receive, readdressing systemic inequalities within, maybe it's around how a particular council is funded, where the money's coming from, giving people agency to create things going forward as well in terms of how they want to see things run in their area. So I hope I've summarized this well, because if I have, should be able to see there's a real difference in approach. Liberation models are about delving into and dismantling oppression. Policy models are about making the current system a bit better. And there is much more tangible change when liberation is done well, and when the people who are affected by negative, oppressive environments are not just included, but are given the lead and empowered to do that and decide how they want to shape things. And creating this environment is not only beneficial for communities and individuals, and if we're thinking about it on a staff level, but of course, it's really going to help change the way things are done. And we know, and I will give the example again, if you put a ramp in front of a building, It, of course, helps wheelchair users, but it helps someone with a heavy bag. It helps someone on crutches temporarily, permanently. It helps people with prams. You get the picture. So if you're looking to foster positive wellbeing culture and would like guidance on creating strategies tailored to your team's needs, then I'm here to support you. Please reach out to explore training, consultancy and coaching services designed to build a healthy, resilient workplace culture. Do email me if you want to know more at Layla, Leyla, at diverseminds.co.uk. I really hope you've enjoyed today's shows and the shows over the last 5 years. So if you have, why not leave me a review on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcast from. And as always, you can leave me a note, an anonymous voice note at bat.ly/SPKPDMP. And don't forget, there's my TEDx talk. It's just 12 minutes long, something you can watch in your break, about the connection between culture, race, and mental health. And that link is bit.ly/TEDx Wolves, WOLVESLO. And if you like anything, please do share, like, especially on YouTube. Don't forget to connect with me on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Blue Sky. So join me in 2 weeks' time where I'll be talking more about the Wheel of Privilege and how it can help power up your equity, diversity, and inclusion work through liberation. Until next time, everyone, take care and bye for now.
Thanks for listening to the Diverse Minds podcast. Don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you access your podcasts from. You can also connect with me on Facebook and LinkedIn. Tune into next week's episode of the podcast, where I'll bring you more insights on mental health and inclusion. Bye for now.